Good evening, Mr. Bengal. Thanks for arranging this meeting. We are happy to have Mr. Diomedes Tsitsouras, who is Executive Director of a labor union of 1,500 faculty members at Rutgers and Rowan University. That union is called the American Association of University Professors, Biomedical and Health Sciences, New Jersey. And the members teach doctors, nurses, scientists, and other health professionals. Before that, Mr. Tsitsouras was Executive Director of the American Association of University Professors at the University of Connecticut Health Center. His work on behalf of unions brought more multi-year appointments, higher minimum pay standards, better access to childcare and parental leave, and less gender-based inequity to the members of the unions. As a lawyer, Mr. Tsitsouras has advocated for individuals from different backgrounds, including immigrants, crime victims, law enforcement officers, to name a few examples. In January 2020, Mr. Tsitsouras was appointed by the New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy as a commissioner to the New Jersey Civil Service Commission. In this capacity, he renders fair and impartial decisions on appeal made to the Commission. Mr. Tsitsouras holds a degree in labor relations and public administration from Cornell University, and he has a Juris Doctor degree from Indiana University, so he's a Hoosier. With that, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Nice to see you all. Nice to see you, Dr. Mazzola. I see you're here. So I guess I'll just get started with sharing my screen here. All right, can folks see that? Okay. So tonight, yes, our theme is white coats and collective action. And the way I sort of phrase it as sort of the overarching idea is building power among physicians. How can physicians exercise, bargain collectively, and kind of take back a lot of the power that they've kind of lost over the last few decades, and can sort of unionization be one way to do that? I also, this presentation, which I've given in other state medical societies, has a component which covers non-compete agreements. If we have time, we'll cover that as well. But non-compete agreements, if you think about it, are also similar in that they kind of restrict the bargaining power of the physician, because they can only work in certain areas. And with these big health systems these days, they can kind of overuse and abuse that market power, which makes it difficult for doctors and patients to for the market to adjust where it should. So that's sort of the overlying concept. So what is collective bargaining? So collective bargaining, and this is the definition from the AFL-CIO, is a process by which working people through their unions, they negotiate with their employers to determine the terms and conditions of employment, including pay, benefits, hours, leave, job health, and safety policies. So essentially, at its very essence, collective bargaining is workers in a workplace coming together and trying to improve something about their workplace. And collective bargaining is the sort of the term of art by which sort of describes that process. Collective bargaining has existed for so long as there's been sort of an industrial America, right? We'll get into sort of the federal law that came in the 1930s, but even before there was a federal law, there were unions, right? Or industrial unions, and they were exercising collective bargaining, doing striking, all of that, right? So you can have collective bargaining even if you don't have a law that sort of guarantees the right. Now, of course, it's preferable to have a federal law to guarantee the right, because back before the law, judges would enjoin, unions call them unfair conspiracies, all sorts of things. So the law actually vested the right in people, and they were able to exercise it more freely. So this applied to doctors. What I usually give as an example, in our new employee orientations at Rutgers, when I try to explain collective bargaining to physicians, I say, okay, what's an issue that's important to you? If you take something like sick days, right? So sick days, at Rutgers, our staff get about 15 days. Our faculty have 22. So I usually tell people at new employee orientation, let's say there was no union here and sick days was a very important issue to you. And let's say, they were offering you 15 days, but you wanted, 18 or 20 or something of that nature. Chances are maybe if they really want to recruit you, they'll put something in an employment contract or offer or something of that nature. But more times than not, they'll just say, listen, our policy is 15 days. If you don't like it, find a job someplace else. And you don't have any ability to really affect that particular term and condition of employment. And so where collective bargaining comes in is, if enough people, let's say enough of our members think sick days is a big issue because we survey that, from time to time, when it comes time to our next union contract negotiation, we'll then try to better that. If it's 15, we'll say, hey, give us 25 days. And maybe we don't get what we want, our proposal in the contract negotiation, but maybe we've improved it. Maybe we compromise, and that's how we get to 22, right? So it's a mechanism by which, if you put sort of the time and effort into it, it could have a lot of impact in a lot of different areas. So why should physicians engage in collective bargaining? It gives doctors a stronger voice and opportunity for communications in the health workplace. So, what the phenomenon has been over the last few decades, there's been a few sort of trends. One is, I think, physicians have sort of ceded sort of ground to other mid-level health professional specialties coming up, physician assistants and nurse practitioners that constantly want more and more authority and scope. And so no longer are people seeing the physician as sort of the authoritative voice. You have all these other voices, which is frustrating, right? Because, in some ways, a lot of people feel like they're not as respected, especially our older physicians that remember a time when, PAs and other folks didn't exist. And so that's one thing that's happened. The other big change, and I have this as a third bullet point, is it focuses on the needs of the doctor as an employee, right? So if you go back even as early as early 2000s, the majority of physicians in the United States own their own practices. So that you had your own private practice, you basically get to call the shots, right? So what happened over the next 15 to 20 years? And I think the turning point was 2010, somewhere there. But now the majority of doctors in the United States are employees. They work for somebody, right? They're not calling the shots. I like to say that doctors went from being the boss to working for the boss, right? And that has all sorts of ramifications because, when you're making the rules, you feel empowered, right? You feel like you don't like something, you can change it. You don't need anyone else's permission. You can have better free reign over how the practice of medicine. And by seeding that, and now as an employee, there's other people now that are sort of have interests and want to make rules. Sometimes, as you all know, like you have healthcare administrators, which there's a lot of good people out there that are healthcare administrators, but oftentimes if they don't come from a medical background, they don't understand the practice and they see kind of only the bottom line, and it creates this friction with those actually providing the care. So I think a lot of these phenomenons, they've also been a contributor to burnout, or as we call it, moral injury, where physicians badly want to practice and do as much good as possible as they were trained to do, but they get into the system and then they realize it's completely different than what they thought it would be when they started on the journey to become a doctor. And so, where collective bargaining comes in, right, is, can a union now be a way of kind of mitigating against these problems, right? So that now I have voice through the union. I have communication channels I did not have before. For example, now that we have health systems that are so highly consolidated, which is another sort of trend that we've seen over the last few decades. You don't have, a single, community hospital anymore. And, you talk about bargaining power, you have community hospital, and then you have, small practices next to the hospital, right? So there's small entities bargaining with one another. That's sort of kind of a fair fight if you want to think about it, right? But now you have huge health systems. I mean, Barnabas here in New Jersey, I believe, is 14 hospitals. Hackensack Meridian is huge. And that really changes the dynamic. And so sometimes you have decisions now made 2 and 3 levels up the corporate ladder, and you can't get problems resolved. So if you have a collective bargaining agent, perhaps that person knows now this bureaucracy can maybe get a problem solved or speak on your behalf. It sort of comes in handy in that kind of environment that did not exist, 20 years ago. And then finally here, a lot of medical societies have had trouble, over the years maintaining membership or growing their membership. So there's sort of an open question, if, medical societies partnered with unions or did collective bargaining themselves, could that be a way of sort of gaining members instead of sort of losing members? Because now you're playing such an essential role within the context of the employment relationship that you weren't playing before, right? So, and that's a whole discussion itself. That's the public point, right? But there's a lot of people seriously considering that. There's medical societies all around the country, including the AMA itself, that have like collective bargaining task forces now to look at these particular questions, right? And I should say that in some places it's a little bit more difficult because the medical societies, this isn't New Jersey, but other states, they actually sometimes have the health systems cutting a check for all the members in that health system to them, which creates these kind of sort of conflict of interest. So it makes them hard to transition to a, collective bargaining kind of regime if they wanted that. So together we can demand improvements. So this is, in 2022 and 23, there's been this sort of uptick in physician organizing in the recent last few years. Some particularly big name health centers around the country, the resident physicians organized, and you can see here that, and this one was like a completely lopsided victory, right, with 81%. So that's been sort of the theme in a variety of places. This is a New York Times story that kind of went into a little bit what I was saying, is that how people believe they are, or at least I should say doctors and pharmacists here feel like that they're basically burned out, that they're just being treated how the New York Times put it, like a clock punching worker, right? So obviously, if that's how you feel, you're going to turn to entities like union to vindicate your interests, right? So about our organization. So I'm the executive director of the AUP BHSNJ. I've been here in this capacity for about 8 years now. As you said in the introduction, I was at UConn Health prior to that. And I'm really excited about the work that we do, right? My dad is actually a retired physician in geriatrics. He was in, academic medicine my entire life. So when I saw UConn Health had a union for medical faculty, I'm like, oh, that's so cool. Like that's because I have so much respect for my dad, right? He came from Greece when he was very young and kind of made his way through here in the United States. And so I really, in the career that he was able to build, I really want to, and what he was able to give me growing up, I want to basically have that same story for any medical faculty member around me, right? And so that's why I think an entity like a union is one way which we can, do that. Especially, if you've seen over time that, I'm going to get back to this slide here, but clinical revenue now is a huge part of a budget of any university. So this is just Rutgers, right? And you can see that of all the sources of revenue, patient care revenue is second to everything. It's almost overtaking tuition for the entire university. And again, this is for the university, not just the medical school, right? So the medical school is floating, other parts of the university. And this is not just a Rutgers thing, right? Like you can pull probably University of California or other systems, and you'll see similar types of graphs, right? But this puts a lot of pressure on medical faculty to produce, right? We need to constantly be seeing patients, not constantly doing work RVUs. And, Rutgers in 2018 entered into a relationship with the Barnabas Health System. And there's a lot of good things from that relationship. We get, mission support funding, for example, every year to help us with research. But they have certain expectations that they want to meet. They think very much like any, corporate health system that you see out there that has certain bottom lines, certain targets, and by golly, they want those met, right? And that creates a certain pressure on our faculty now, right? That sort of didn't exist before. What has our union accomplished? So these are just a few things that we've successfully bargained, right? So minimum pay standards. We have in our union contract pay that's pegged essentially to the American Association of Medical Colleges. So every year they publish a survey based on rank and specialty. And when I say rank, that's academic rank, like assistant professor, associate, full professor, and then specialty, right? And then you can see, what the first quartile pay is, the median, et cetera. So we have a standard within our contract, again, a minimum standard by which everybody has to be paid that salary. Historically, at Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, when I started as executive director, I believe there was lots of faculty in the 10th percentile nationally. Now, thanks to this provision and plus other kinds of things that we've done, we have certain departments that are at median pay for the country, other ones that, are a little bit under that, right? But it's far better than it was before. And it should still, in my opinion, too low, right? Because it's very costly to live here in New Jersey. We should be paid much better than average. But at least we're sort of pushing things in the right direction. We've bargained a fairer use of the work RVU data tables. Having a component of pay based on productivity or work RVUs is very common to physician employment contracts. But often employers will want a lot of the risk to be shifted onto the physician, right? And so if the productivity doesn't pan out, it's on the physician, not on the health system. So where we come in is saying, okay, yeah, sure, we can have an incentive or a bonus based on work RVUs. We're not going to have, half somebody, 50% of somebody's pay based on work RVUs though, right? Because oftentimes, as you probably already know this, there's only so much you can control as a doctor, right? You're not out there with a sandwich board, waving patients into the clinic, right? You're not advertising, doing that stuff. That's all within the control of whomever you work for, right? And so we don't want, the risk to be unnecessarily on the physician. We've improved, childcare, parental leave, longer appointments, which is very key because during the appointment process, the appointment period, you can only be fired for cause. So the longer your appointment, the longer your job security protection. And so what is the status of physician unions today? The short answer is that it's grown, right? A 26% increase from 24 to 2019. Some of the data is not as sort of current, right? If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But I think, if you sort of the latest sort of data, if you went from 20 to 25, you would see also an increase there. But yeah, it's been growing. It's still a big minority of the physician workforce. Among resident physicians, it's a much larger percentage. But for it to sort of become sort of the market norm, there's still ways to go, right? What is the applicable law that enables collective bargaining? So for private sector employees, it's called the National Labor Relations Act. The law created in the 1930s. during the Great Depression, to give workers more bargaining power, right? Prior to that, like I said, there were unions, but they encountered all sorts of problems. And because they did not have a sort of a bona fide, legally sanctioned way of going about collective bargaining, there was a lot of fighting, right? You had strikes, you had some strikes that were bloody strikes with violence. So the thought was that if we had an organized way to do this, you're going to have less, people at each other's throats, less adversity, and you'd be able to sort of have a more harmonious work environment, and at the same time give workers more bargaining power. Now that the law itself, which we'll go into, has problems with it. There's a lot of holes in it that get exploited. But by and large, it is, a decent mechanism to give workers sort of a right to both concerted activity and collective bargaining. I put these other ones out here to show you that there are other sort of laws that govern collective bargaining, not just the National Labor Relations Act. The National Labor Relations Act will be for any private sector, but any kind of state will do their own collective bargaining, right? So here in New Jersey, we have the New Jersey Employee Relations Act. That's what governs our union, right, at Rutgers. And also the School of Osteopathic Medicine in Rowan that we represent, that's all public, right? So none of the issues that come about in the federal law we have to worry about, right? Because we have full sort of control over it. If there's a problem, which we, by the way, we've amended that law itself a couple of times within the last few years that I've been here, so we can better sort of fix problems, when they, arise. And generally speaking, a state law is better towards the forming a union than federal law. A lot of those loopholes that employers can exploit don't exist in our law here in New Jersey, and we'll get into a couple of those in a second. So I guess sort of give the sort of the kind of go through the steps here to what it means for physicians to use the National Labor Relations Act. So generally the idea is that anybody who's quote an employee has the right to form a union. What's an employee? Employee is a legally defined term by the Act, and it's essentially somebody who's not what we call a confidential employee, which means that they're dealing with sort of confidential matters of other employees or labor relations, and they're not a supervisor, right? A supervisor is somebody who performs supervisory work, and there's a specific definition of duties. And if you're not a supervisor, you're not a confidential employee, then you are a quote employee within the meaning of the Act, and you get the right to go form a union. The question of whether doctors are supervisors, that's been tested a number of times, even recently, and the board has sort of repeatedly found that doctors are not supervisors. And they do have access to be able to form a union through the National Labor Relations Act. So what the second bullet here is, I think, also important, that you don't have to have a union to get the protections of the National Labor Relations Act. So there's various protections, especially with non-retaliation, various other kinds of things there. The idea is that it can protect what I said before, concerted activity, right? So if you and other doctors want to all sign your name to a petition about how there's not enough PPE, or the instruments in the operating room are all dirty, and it's a problem with patient care, right? And you bring that to the CEO of the hospital. You don't have a union, right? You just do that. You do your petition. You have the protections of the National Labor Relations Act, right? Because that's activity that you're doing in concert. And of course, you have other protections through state law, right? And I don't want to get off topic, but we have a whistleblower law here in New Jersey. So if something bad happened to your employment, not only would it be a violation of the NLRA, but it would also be a whistleblower problem as well. But it's still a very important protection to have, right? And the reason why the National Labor Relations Act protects both the concerted activity and the formation of the union is so that you can form the union in the first place, right? Because if the protections didn't attach immediately, then the retaliation could happen immediately. You never get towards the union formation, right? And so how are unions formed and contracts negotiated? So the process is essentially what we call a card drive, right? So, and you can do this without the, assistance, by the way, of a formal union, like a national union or a local one here in New Jersey. Anybody can do this, right? Um, and essentially the process involves, employees in a workplace, they get a majority of people signing a union card. The union card will say something like, we want to form a union under we call ourselves the New Jersey Doctors of America or something like that, right? And we want that entity to be what's called the exclusive representative to bargain our terms and conditions of employment. So you get a majority of your colleagues to sign a card. Actually, you just need 30% to petition for an election, but often because, employers kind of do what we call a counter organizing campaign, we try to get much more support than that. So we typically want, 60, 70% of people filing cards before we go to the National Labor Relations Board. And so you get a majority of cards, and the employees have to be sort of what they call logically placed together for the purposes of bargaining. So the idea is that you can't have, somebody who's scrubbing the floors and a neurosurgeon in the same what we call unit, right? Because they do something completely fundamentally different, and they don't have a community of interest. So if I'm trying to bargain on behalf of employees that have such divergent interests, then it's going to be almost impossible or very hard. So you have to show that you're logically placed. So usually if it's a cards of all doctors, you're not going to have a problem with that. But occasionally we will see units where you have physicians, maybe some PAs and APRNs. Those unions do exist out there as well, where you have people together. Actually, at Rutgers, even though we're not under the National Labor Relations Act, we have, other faculty, not just clinician faculty within our union, right? And under what we call our bargaining unit. And now you have a majority of cards. You can seek what's called voluntary recognition from the employer. The employer could say, great, you have a majority of cards, I'm going to bargain with you. If that doesn't happen, then you could petition for an election from the National Labor Relations Board. Once the election happens, and assuming you win the majority of votes cast in that election, then you're certified by the National Labor Relations Board. And of course, all these steps here, makes it sound simple here with these bullet points, but each of these is a step where there's going to be lots of, fights, litigation, that kind of thing. It goes, pretty quickly with the board, like much quicker than you would see a case, in state or federal court, right? But still, like if an employer wants to fight some of these steps, they sometimes will try to, raise objections in each of these. As I said before, there's a lot of pressures on physicians to produce, especially with work RVUs. There's an increase in sort of corporatization of healthcare in the United States. I just came from a conference of other, medical faculty, medical association lawyers. They had a whole section just on the corporate practice of medicine and how those loopholes are being exploited, especially by private equity entities that want to basically go in, get a quick return, and get out, and that doesn't always very compatible with the practice of medicine. Where unions come in again, to the extent that doctors are being treated in this environment of corporatization, unions can be sort of that sort of counterbalance. And I have the second bullet point here. During the 1990s, there were a lot of antitrust concerns that existed with physicians, again, because physicians weren't just employees, they had their own practices. So, the fear was that if doctors were too organized, it would have this unjust, market power. Of course, we all know that's bullshit because, the health insurance companies have always had, an unfair advantage, let's say. So, but a lot of those antitrust concerns, I don't think necessarily would exist today. Maybe technically on the books, for independent practices, sort of colluding, that's still probably technically the law, but it's a completely different market, right? So even if you had those few remaining practices working together, there's no way in hell that, they're going to be a competitive threat to, the Barnabas Health System or something like that, right? Um, so it's a completely different landscape, market wise. Striking, right? So this is a really important question, right? And if you look at anything, any sort of like the opinion pieces you might see in the AMA journal, or you might go to another talk about physicians and unions, like striking gets like sucked into the conversation immediately, right? It's always like, should doctors have unions and striking? Like it's almost as if it's like, joined at the hip when you have the conversation. So what I'd like to urge at least is that it not be joined at the hip, right? Because you can have collective bargaining without striking, right? And the statistic is that I think it's something about 2 or 3% of contract negotiations will have a strike in a given year. So you could go your whole career in a union, multiple contracts that get negotiated over many different terms, and never be in a strike, right? So it's not something that's common even outside of physicians. It's probably even more uncommon when you look at physicians that are in unions, right? Um, and that's largely because physicians have also other ways of exercising power, right? Usually, they're still the sort of the brand name that gets advertised out there, right? So health systems are a little bit nervous, right, about their doctors being unhappy, at least if they're saying that in a collective way, if they're talking to journalists, if they're talking to politicians, there's a fair amount of potential embarrassment there, right? So those are mechanisms by which you can exercise collective power without necessarily having to strike. And the other thing is that when it comes to striking, nobody is forcing, people in the union to strike, right? By law, there has to be a vote of the members. And typically, workers will not go on strike unless A, there's a huge turnout of people, and then B, everyone's saying, yes, I want to strike, right? Because if you strike and only half the people participate, no good, right? Like you don't have any power that way if you don't actually shut down the operation. So, it's not some third party, not some entity in Washington saying, oh, you local have to go on strike over there. If there's a willingness, that would mean, and you would have to get all your clinician colleagues to say that same yes, then that's when it would happen. So it's not like something that's going to be sort of necessarily easy, even if there were people in your union that wanted to do that. At Rutgers, interestingly, right, this was in 2023. We did go on strike. We have one contract at Rutgers for both the medical faculty and legacy Rutgers faculty. And there's certain parts of the contract that are just very clinician specific on RVUs, on AMC minimum pay standards, but it's still one contract, right? And it got to a point in the negotiation where it was just an impasse both on our issues and the legacy Rutgers issue. So our faculty did vote to go on strike. We did not strike any patient care. We also didn't strike any essential research. But when we did have the opportunity, on let's say a lunch or something, our clinicians did go to the picket lines and show their support. We did strike academic work during that week. We asked people to refrain from going to committee meetings, that kind of thing. Um, so the other part, obviously, with striking is that there's a lot of patient safety concerns, understandably. There was recently a strike in Oregon with a major health system there. And it was mostly the nurses striking, but this nurses unit had a few physicians in it, right? And the Oregon Medical Society got questions from the doctors, how can we participate in the strike and still not be accused of patient abandonment, make sure our patients are safe, et cetera. So I helped sort of counsel the Oregon Society a little bit about how do you walk that line. And I think they were able to, or at least most doctors were able to do that by, participating sometimes more than a nurse was, obviously, but, not doing the full, amount of activities that they normally do during that time so that they were still doing their part for the strike while at the same time doing their part for their patients. Um, and then, of course, sometimes, like I said, we're striking and unions aren't the same thing. You have a lot of times where a law prohibits striking. So, for example, in New York, state employees are prohibited from striking by law. Now, it still happens occasionally. You'll see the sanitation workers in New York City threaten to strike, or the subway operators, but it's technically illegal, right? Um, and in New Jersey, it's actually an unsettled question whether public sector workers have a right to strike. It's not banned, but it's not in the law either. So, it's sort of kind of on a case by case basis what, a court might think with these public sector workers striking. Um, so, are there challenges physicians face in forming a union? Yes, of course, right? Um, you know, employers, sometimes just because of how the HR people are trained, often other times because, people sort of sometimes upper management panics. Oh, our certain group of workers is organizing. I'm going to lose control of the workplace, right? That's the knee-jerk sort of fear that happens. It's not even the economic a lot of time, right? That, oh no, I'm going to have to pay more for benefits or something. It's usually I'm going to have somebody else here that I have to bargain with, and I'm just going to fight it, right? So they'll actually hire lots of times anti-union consulting firm to come in. And this, by the way, just a quick story. This actually happened with our union recently. So a few years ago, Rutgers decided that through its affiliation with the Robert Wood Johnson Barnabas Health System, it was going to hire clinician faculty through the health system in this sort of hybrid fashion, right? So that it was 90% health system and a paycheck coming directly from Barnabas, and the other 10% being Rutgers. And convenient enough, the 10% Rutgers wasn't high enough to qualify for collective bargaining rights under the state law, right? So they could effectively get around collective bargaining by shifting the hiring to Barnabas. And of course, all these individuals, they call them clinically focused university professionals, right? Which is a very fancy, acronym. I don't know why they had that, but they call them CFUPs, right? These CFUPs were identical to Rutgers clinician faculty, right? They have offices in our same building. They're billing the same way. They're reporting to the same chair of medicine or pediatrics or whatever, identical. The only difference is on paper, they're this special hybrid. And this, of course, started to erode our bargaining unit in the Robert Wood Johnson Barnabas Health System. So in 2024, a lot of them got really frustrated and say, why don't we have the union too? And we said, we should give you the union, right? And so we actually petitioned the National Labor Relations Board to have CFUPs as their own entity. And we got a majority of cards. We actually got 60 or 70% of these newly hired faculty to sign cards. And we successfully petitioned the NLRB, and we won the election. And so for the time being, we actually have a private sector entity right alongside our Rutgers entity. But this wasn't sort of an easy process, right? So before the election, Barnabas had hired a consulting firm, the same anti-union consultant Amazon hired to talk to the physicians and say, again, how bad unions are. And, it's all about our dues money and all this other kind of worked. You know, fortunately,
Dio, I think your connection might be a little bit unstable.
but
I would suggest you might want to turn off your video.
oh, Yeah, sure. Is that better? Can you hear?
Yeah, now it's coming through a little bit better.
Much.
Dio, I think we've lost you actually.
Maybe I should
Dio, do you want to
try
log out
to
and re-log in? You're really
um,
glitchy.
maybe. Okay, sure. I'll try. I'll try that.
No, actually now, no. He was just starting to sound pretty good when I logged out.
I thought so too, and I had glitches getting.
Three more slides. Should I just finish that?
Oh yeah, do you want to just finish? Sure, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So is collective bargaining appropriate for all physicians? Not always. There's always going to be a certain group that, for whatever reason, may not it may not be a good fit. But largely, I think it can be a tool that really supports, doctors in this sort of new environment. And there's a lot of things. And in this slide, I show that there's things that we can do to support the physician employee. That could be giving trainings, that could be, advising doctors on how to, read their employment contracts. There's a lot you can do short of actually forming, an official union. All right, so questions.
Yeah, so you
Dr.
guys move
Mazzola.
forward.
You knew it would be me. So
Yeah,
how would like a physician union in New Jersey, like what would that actually like look like? Because, even though I would say probably 60 to 70% of physicians in New Jersey are hospital employed now. And it's interesting, right? Because you have private practice physicians, you have hospital employed physicians, and you have university employed physicians. So it's like three different groups, right? And right now, the way it is in New Jersey is only the university um, employed physicians have a union, which DO represents. So how would this look for like private practice physicians, and how would this look for hospital employed physicians? Would there be one union versus, all these other hospital systems, or would there be like a union of the Hackensack Meridian Network employed physicians, a union for the Atlantic Health employed physicians? What would that look like, Dio?
Yeah, so you could have so there's a sort of a difference between the bargaining entity and the union, the local, right? So there's a union called the Health Professional. Can people hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, good. Okay. There's a union called the Health Professionals Allied Employees, HPAE. They don't have doctors, but they actually represent people both in the private sector, hospitals, and they represent uh, health professionals at University Hospital and Rutgers. So each of those, though, even though it's one entity, one local, they have different contracts for different places. Right. So something, if it would take a lot of work, obviously, to put together an organization for physicians, but
Um, can I,
you could see how you might have.
um, Norm Luca, I'm a retired physician, practiced in New Jersey since 1977. In 1998, a group of us actually formed a union in New Jersey under the AFL-CIO. We were actually lodge number 8 of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. We got a quite a few interested. And the context back then was in the era of IPAs, physicians were realizing that they were losing their voice in the practice of medicine, because the reality was there were three entities in a sense. There were people who needed our care, there were people who provided the care, and then there were people who were paying for the care. And it was not really a normal rational market between those three entities. So out of curiosity, a group of us decided, could we form a union? Back then, we were told we could not. And we met with the AFL-CIO, and they said, well, based on, kind of strangely enough, they had just organized limousine drivers. And so why did that apply to us? Well, we have to have a license. We have specialized education. Basically, our work rules are set by other individuals. In other words, you have to have a license to practice in New Jersey, and you have to meet certain standards. And we had really almost no control over how we were paid. So their opinion was that if we chose, we could organize and we would probably win in court. Now, it didn't happen. We had a lot of interest, and for me back then, it was a learning lesson because I've been involved in other types of union negotiation, but it could be done. I think right now for you younger folks, we are at a really nodal time because we were all mostly independent practitioners. And I think what our speaker has been talking about, something that really comes out of like the teachers union. It's an academic situations where there's tenure and salary, but there was a model amongst academic teachers that was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me sort of comes out of the context of organized teachers unions and the like. What's different in our very short time, I think, is just Kathy just said, most of us now, I'm now retired, are now employed, and what I see happening is physicians are losing their voice. Now, there is an entity which is called the organized medical staff. And basically the organized medical staff is a mandated entity that the board of trustees of the institutions need to deal with. And to the extent that that was independent and powerful, and I think Nicole will agree, at least at Overlook and Morristown, the physician entity is pretty strong. And if it chose to have a voice, I think it could be stronger as far as the employed physicians are concerned, or at least to the extent that they see themselves as somewhat independent, they have some voice there. But I do think that, and I've said this for a long time, and that's why I joined tonight. I said, I just knew that within my lifetime, I was going to have this conversation of how do physicians organize, and I think the allied health profession as well, how do we organize in a way where we can start to take back some control, not just of salary and things like that, but actually we need a strong voice that actually counters some of the economic drivers of corporate medicine that are getting in the way maybe of delivering good health care. I don't know where it's going to go. But I just think that the very fact that the Medical Society of New Jersey is having this conversation is really, really important. And I really encourage you to keep doing it. I don't know exactly how it works out, but physicians, hi Nicole. I think I practiced for 50 years, and I really do think that it's important that physicians come together with their other allied health professionals to figure out how to negotiate this period collectively. So I just wanted to kind of give you that perspective, and I appreciate. Actually, I think Nicole as president. It's one of the smartest and best things that the Southern Union County, but the Medical Society has done in a long time, because of all the issues that we've talked about over the years. This is really an important one to the extent that you're going to retain physicians. create interested physicians, but most importantly, really deliver great health care. And I just worry that two of my friends are getting burned out and so forth. So I'll turn myself off, but thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Norm. He's wonderful. He's been a great physician advocate. We worked together at Overlook Hospital. I remember way back when, so the medical staff bylaws used to be that at least for our department, they were not to be a hospital employee so that we could maintain that independence. And then we had to change the bylaws as more physicians became hospital employees, because then it was a matter of just getting people who could take the position. But that was kind of part of, I think, some of the loss of the power of the medical staff. But we still retain a good amount of power because, like Dr. Giamatti said, is the goodwill with patients comes through the doctors and the care that we provide. And so there should still be some back and forth that preserves, I think it's the doctor dignity. When they say it's burnout, it's really just that personal injury that you feel from just lack of control. When they do the studies, it's just the loss of control usually that causes that burnout. I think I would be interested because what we've been doing, what I know with my situation, so it's a independent, physician organization with Summit Medical Group, but then the difficulty has been that it went from just physician governed to, as they merged and merged and merged again, it's the private equity got involved. And now when Village MD purchased us and Walgreens became the owner, and that decided not to happen, Sycamore, as I think it's in the news, purchased, and they're private equity, and they basically gonna do what we expect, which is divvy it up and make a profit where they can. It's forced each individual physician to kind of feel like we're just treading water, and you have to get a lawyer, you have to try to solve things. It's become, and it'd be interesting to know if we could do something where even like a base pay or something, scale, because they can use the MGMA any year that they want, as opposed to, you would think with unions or even with the state, there's a minimum wage. So we should be paid 2025 rates. You can get paid any rate of any year that they want to pay you. And you have no recourse if you're a physician, because you don't have the bargaining power. They basically tell you take it or leave it. All the contracts that they sign up for, you're stuck doing those RVUs trying to get the RVUs, but the QM tabs, things that are just onerous,
I
So,
think that the thing that I've seen is that I asked most of my colleagues, and I became a member of the Atlantic Medical Group. I mean, for two reasons. One, I had been a chief medical officer, so I've seen both sides of this, and I have some understanding there. But the reality is that the ability for an individual to practice it's not there. The cost of being a physician to do good work, to have access to the knowledge base you need, your associates, your colleagues. Why have physicians joined, whether it's the Summit Medical Group? And quite honestly, they were first out of the box and early on. They really got it right. I can't say where it's going right now. I think things like the Atlantic Medical Group are and there's two entities that I know in Atlantic Health right now. But why are we joining it? I mean, for me, it was I could not afford it. I was a cardiovascular, I'm basically a non-cardiac thoracic surgeon, and not many of us in the state. As a practitioner, and based on the care base that I had, it would have been virtually impossible for me to be an independent solo practitioner. I couldn't have, it wouldn't cover the cost of the expense of the practice. So one is, why are physicians joining? I can understand on the faculty basis, Ms. Thesaurus, is that there's a tradition, and I understand that. But what's really changing is there are very few individual private practitioners. When I ask all my colleagues, why did you join SMG or the independent group that's up at Sam Posner's group or Atlantic Medical Group, it's just they couldn't afford not to do it. And it was an economic driver. Now you're in that camp. I just don't think they're really ready to give up their ability to want to drive the ship in terms of quality of care, not only just compensation and everything else, but so, it's really a very important moment, I think, in our history, as to where the role of collective action creates a benefit for both the physician and the patient. But I mean, tell me why all of my colleagues have joined who are still practicing. The-
You're asking me? Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, like I said, like most people have have shifted away from, physician-owned practices, and they're now owned by health systems, and and physicians are more just like any other employee, and for that reason, that's why they're turning to things like our, unions to, you know, maybe give them some more power or seat at the table they didn't have before.
I see Dr. Mazzola has her hand up.
Yeah, and to answer Norm Luca's question, I think once the government got very involved in managing healthcare, the payments to physicians decreased substantially. And then, like, unfunded, unreimbursed government mandates, such as utilization of an EMR, many physicians' offices were not equipped to deal with that and couldn't afford an EMR. And it was like a paradigm shift that many physicians were not prepared for. How do you maintain compliance with all these rules and regulations? So I think eventually physicians lost because the AMA, which we thought was like our union representative, did not really defend us, or protect us in that regard. So I do think many private physicians' offices collapsed. But what I'm seeing now, Norm, is very frightening. So in some hospitals, you would think that the medical executive committee is your representation as a physician, whether you're hospital employed or you're in private practice. And what many MECs have now become are like organizations that fully represent the employer in any and all regards. So for example, it used to be a rule at Morristown that the MEC board had to be made up of at least 50% privately employed and 50% hospital employed physicians. That's no longer the case. There was a bylaws change that was pushed through during the regime of a hospital employed president of the medical staff, which basically said every department chair had to be hospital employed. So that stacked the MEC with all hospital employed physicians. So the MEC now, in effect, is really the hospital or the administration's voice. It is not the voice of physicians anymore. Because if you're a chair of a department, you would be, it would not behoove you to vote independently. You will always vote the way your employer wants you to vote. Or you'll lose your job. You'll be replaced. Your contract won't be renewed. So many hospital employed physicians are afraid to speak up for physician rights because they are afraid of losing their job. So their positions on the MEC are almost worthless.
I mean, I believe the way medical staffs work is you're elected to those positions. Some of them are appointed by virtue of their chairmanships, but you're absolutely right. This is why, the medical staff. What is unique here is that the medical staff is a defined, unique entity that you can, if collectively, even with or without the union, it's going to require collective effort on a part of the membership of that particular hospital to decide who sits on the MEC and what their rules are and regulations. And now, collective bargaining, which you can learn from a union-like entity. I mean, how do you do those sorts of things to make sure you get your representation? You can learn from that. I don't disagree with you, but that is the challenge for today. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why this conversation is really important. You're not going to come up with answers tonight. I just hope you just come away from this with the idea of, listen, what works? I mean, guys join practices, but guys, I use that as a a non-gender term, but they've joined practices, Summit Medical Group or Atlantic Medical Group, because economically it was the only way to continue to practice, made their life easier. I mean, a whole bunch of my friends said, why did you join the Summit Medical Group? Because my life got really easy. But now I'm in an entity. Did I sell my soul to the devil? How do I now get control? Well, older guys are saying, I can see the horse can see the barn. I need a few more years. I'm getting paid well. I'm out of here anyway. It's this younger generation that I think Nicole and you all look pretty young to me, need to wrestle with and figure out how to do it. And I think, well, I'm not advocating a union necessarily because I did it and I can actually hold up my card. This was my union card. I have always kept it. Grounding thought, but you got to do it. And so anyway, I'm here to encourage you to think collectively.
Dio, any concluding words?
Oh, no, thank you so much for the opportunity. And, I'm hopeful that we can have, further discussions and further adventures into the employment space, in the future, so that we can, build the strength of doctors here in New Jersey.
I would just say one thing.
I would say,
You use the term employee. I think that organized physicians need to be more than employees. They have to be not just negotiating with some entity that's basically telling them what to do and how to do it, and you negotiate over work rules. I think the collectively physicians need to be in a place where you do more than that, where you actually are in control of creating the best set of work rules that ends up giving great patient care. And quite frankly, I think only physicians can figure out how to make it value-based, cost correct, and how to do that. And I had some experience in doing that, and I know we can do that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, there's other things that, are out there, like physician-owned hospitals and putting more physicians on board of directors, and definitely anything that improves the voice and preserves medical judgment is worthy of us doing it.
I mean, lean on the boards of trustees of the institutions to say that there has to be more physicians with actual clinical practice on those boards to keep the perspectives correct. And that's a thing that you actually can do because they still respect us for what we do.
but who governs them? Like who can mandate that they or enforce that they have to do that?
That's what collective bargaining can do for you. You can if a board of trustees and understands that collectively the physicians who basically provide all the care, who basically are responsible for the costs and cost savings, they can't do it without us. If it weren't for patients and physicians, hospitals wouldn't run great. Well, that's not true. So I think for you young folks, you've got to figure out who's on the board of trustees, and you need to network with them and make them understand what your life is like and why it's changing, and how fixing that is going to be good for the hospital's reputation, and most importantly for patient care and managing costs, because that is a big issue for today, and only we can do that.
Mhm. So I guess food, thank you so much, Dr. Tsitsaris, am I saying right?
I'm not a doctor. I'm just a lawyer.
Oh, sorry about that. Look, I
But
just
thank
promoted
you.
you. But if there's areas that we could do like next steps, so as the medical society, we do represent all the different physicians, initially the independent, but we have employed in all the sectors that Dr. Mazzola said. There's even the direct primary care docs who I'm sure would benefit because they are trying to be independent, yet they also have some guidelines that they have to follow. So steps for the medical society that we can somehow try to collectively bargain or bring these issues to the table. Because
Yeah, I mean, so
employers,
what I was telling Josh before the meeting was that, there's other states that they have like a collective bargaining task force that the society has put together, and just to start the conversation, like and some of them are developing a little, white paper or that kind of thing, to sort of forecast what exactly the engagement in the space should look like. Should it just be, some support of other unions? Should it be partnering? Should it be doing collective bargaining ourselves? Answering sort of those questions and spending a little more time on them. So that's what I would recommend. I mean, I don't want to, it's obviously, President Blumenthal and Josh's call what to do, but, there are other states that I think are doing that. It would probably be a healthy thing for New Jersey as well.
yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking if I put my hat on the employer side, they know there's an avalanche of unhappy physicians out there because people are leaving, the great resignation, as they call it. And so I think they know it's in their best interest to try to come to some type of compromise. It's just right now it's profits and that are driving a lot of it. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. So we'll try something like that and try to collaborate where we see best practices.
Can I make a suggestion? What you need to do is continue these conversations. Now, collective bargaining and collective bargaining agreements are the tools that can be used to get to where you want to go. From an engagement standpoint, I'm not so sure using that term is the best one to use. I think you need to find language to just have more of these things where you talk about how do physicians do X, Y, or Z? What's the itch that needs to be scratched? Define that, and so you poll your membership. We find out and say, well, I'm not happy. Maybe it's just salary. Or I don't like the fact that it's what, and have those conversations, because out of those conversations, I think will come how one can do things collectively. And that's for a term from which CBAs come from. But it's the tool that you use after you've gotten folks to articulate what it is they want to solve and how they want to solve it. And that's your generation. I came from a great generation, but as an older guy, and I see what's happening because I just retired from that you've got to get this conversation going with the membership and grow your membership. And then and then you have, this is the best time I think in years that the county and the state society has an opportunity to really speak to the issues of what's troubling us today as physicians. And you actually, because you are a collective group, have the power of the collective to do something. I'm going to go away. I thank you guys for listening to me. I appreciate the opportunity to vent something I think about a lot.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate your involvement, right? And invite you to stay involved. I think, are we at time? I'll let Josh wrap it up.
Josh, perhaps we've heard the important arguments and it's time to wrap it up.